Imagine you throw a ball straight up from the surface of the Earth. It will rise to some height and then return. So, Earth, you throw the ball, and it goes up to some distance. Actually, really, we should do this. Here's the Earth. You throw the ball with some initial velocity, it gets to some height, and then it comes back down. The height will depend on the speed, of course, but eventually it will come to rest and fall back down. You could find the height by computing the initial energy and seeing where the kinetic energy became 0. And you can imagine turning that problem around. If I want to reach a certain height, how fast do I throw the ball? You've done this problem a lot. If I want to get this distance height, h, and I would say something like a half mv square is mgh. No big deal. Of course, this is in this circumstance where we can use this as potential energy. And we know that in astronomical systems, not. So if we threw it harder from the surface of the Earth, then we might have to use the minus gmm over r, our formulation. But we could still do it. It would look something like this. This isn't particularly pretty, but it is very straightforward. Given the height h, you can solve for the speed you need. In this case, of course, notice that we have to do things like include the shift in the distance from the center of the Earth. We start off in the radius of the Earth, and we end up some distance further away, which means, of course, that this number is less negative than this number, which allows us to have the kinetic energy there. But then it gets interesting. We could do that for any height. All right? The faster we threw the ball, the higher it would go. The longer it would take to stop and then turn around. Not a big deal. But let's say we get something really far out, like 10 to the 9 Earth radii, or even more. In that case, the term on the right is essentially 0, because we'd have that this term would be something like minus g-m-e-m over essentially infinity, which is 0. And therefore, the speed we would need would be this, the square root of 2 times universal constant times the mass of the Earth over the radius. But the place where it comes to rest is then infinitely far away, which means it never turns around, because it never gets to that infinite place. It's always losing speed, but it never gets to a place of 0, and it can't turn around until it first comes to rest. We say that it has escaped from the Earth, and we call this the escape speed from the surface of the Earth. Anything launched at that speed will leave and never come back. Caveat. This is really assuming if the Earth's the only thing in the universe. It doesn't come back to the Earth, but other gravitating objects will make life a little bit more complicated. Although we derive this for the Earth, we can obviously use the same reasoning for any gravitating body. For instance, to escape from the moon's surface, we would take the same thing, the velocity of escape from the moon is, but we replace the Earth's mass with the moon's mass, and the Earth's radius with the moon's radius, which have these particular values, and we'll get 2370 meters per second. That's only about 20% of the escape speed for the Earth. That's why the rocket engines on the lunar lander could be so much smaller than those on the Saturn V that was needed to reach the moon. All right, we launched from a huge multi-story, multi-stage thing, and you come back to that almost cartoonishly small rockets to get home. All right, 5 hypothetical planets have the masses and radii shown. Draw a blue circle around the planet with the greatest escape speed and a red circle around planets with the least escape speed. So remember that the escape speed is the square root of 2g mass of the Earth, or whatever of the planet, let's say, over the radius of the planet. So we'll take this as our standard 1. Let's see m and r. When we have twice as much, we get something like root 2 as high a speed, twice as much mass. When we have 1/4 of the radius, since the radius is on the bottom, we end up with only 1/2, it's square root of a quarter, of the escape speed. When we have 4 times the mass over twice the radius, we get a factor of 4 up here, but divided by 2, so that's a total square root factor of root 2. And that when we have 4 times the mass over 4 times the radius, that goes up by 4, but that goes up by 4, and we get exactly the same values. So looking at that, our largest values are B and D, and our least value is C. And we do see that A and E turn out to be equal, although that's neither largest nor smallest. This leads actually to the concept of black holes. Black holes are complicated and fascinating objects. Although a true understanding requires relativity theory, which we don't cover here, we get a feel for them just using Newtonian concepts. Imagine an object of mass m and radius r such that the escape speed at its surface happens to equal c, the speed of light. Such an object would appear black because light could never escape it to reach your eyes. In other words, we would have our object and it would radiate, but at some point that light would stop and fall back down. By the way, this is not at all what would happen, but it's a Newtonian view of what would happen. Since nothing could move faster than the speed of light, then nothing else can escape it either. So it would seem to absorb everything. And that's the original idea behind black holes. Massive stars that were so dense that the escape speed was greater than light, and so you could never see them. They would look like holes in the sky. We now know that black holes are common throughout the universe, both as corpses of large stars and at the hearts of galaxies, and maybe very small ones left over from near the Big Bang. They are not Newtonian objects, but it turns out that the calculations you do end up giving you the Newtonian result, which is kind of fascinating. We can figure out how big an object would have to be by setting the escape velocity equal to c. So remember that the escape velocity was square root of 2 times big G times the mass over the radius. So we can turn all that around and we say, the radius of the star would have to be 2 times big G times the mass of the star over c squared. This is what's called the Schwarzschild radius, named after the person who first really investigated it, although not for Newtonian objects, but for Einsteinian objects. Schwarzschild was an artillery officer in the German army, and during World War I, one of the ways he distracted himself from the horrors on the front was to try and go through Einstein's general relativity. And he would write to Einstein and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. And a lot of his work was captured in what would happen in Einstein relativity if the central object had this kind of size. For a star the mass of the sun, that radius turns out to be about 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 2.9 kilometers. So if you sort of look, it's not as big as Tulsa. All right, here's a little bit of South Tulsa, centered on TCC for historical reasons, and it gets about 2 grid boxes. Only a few years ago, for the first time, people imaged a black hole, which is obviously this object. How do they know it's a black hole? Because from the stuff orbiting it that we have here, they can compute the central mass, and they know this based on the distance away. They know how big this region is, and it turns out that it's smaller than a Schwarzschild radius. So it's the first time it's ever been imaged directly. Now, again, to be real, black holes are far more complicated than just very dense Newtonian objects. They distort space and time around them in fascinating ways that sadly are not rewarded in an AP curriculum to talk about, although after the exam we might do a little bit.